They say some women arrive like storms, unexpected, half-frozen, and carrying more silence than sound. He found her in the snow, veil torn, lips blue, letter half-burnt in her hand. She'd come west chasing a promise, but the man she came for was long gone. And the one who saved her, he was never meant to find her, never meant to feel anything at all. But in a cabin meant for silence, they found something neither of them were looking for. A fire that burned steady, a name that wasn't borrowed, a love that asked nothing but gave everything. What would you have done if a woman like that showed up at your doorstep, battered, broken, and still wearing a wedding dress for a man who wasn't you? Tell me down in the comments. Should Calder have told her the truth sooner? And if you were Marbel, would you have stayed? A sprig of one, the wind, a mournful beast, clawed at the eaves of Calder's cabin, its voice a familiar symphony of desolation in the vast, snow-choked wilderness of the high Montana territories. Inside, the only answer was the crackle of the potbelly stove and the occasional contented sigh from Buck, his aging blue heeler, whose grizzled muzzle rested on equally grizzled paws. For 10 years, since Eliza, since before, Calder had carved a life from these woods, solitude. His closest companion, Buck his only confidant. The seasons turned, each much like the last, marked by the deepening snows of winter and the fleeting green of summer, a rhythm as unchanging as the granite peaks that loomed over his valley. Tonight, however, the rhythm broke. Buck, usually a creature of habit, content to drowse by the fire after a meager supper of rabbit stew, stirred with a low growl. His ears pricked. He rose, stiff-limbed, and padded to the door, a deeper rumble vibrating in his chest. "Easy, old man," Calder murmured, his voice raspy from disuse, just the wind playing its tricks. But Buck was insistent, a rare urgency in his whine, his nose pressed to the crack beneath the door. Calder sighed, levering himself from his worn armchair. The hound didn't spook at shadows. He set down the mending, a torn strap on a snowshoe, and pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat. The moment he unlatched the door, the wind shrieked in, flinging a barrage of icy pellets that stung his weathered face. Snowflakes, thick as goose down, swirled in a blinding curtain. Buck, without hesitation, plunged into the maelstrom, barking sharply, a sound quickly swallowed by the storm. Cursing under his breath, Calder grabbed his rifle, more habit than expectation, and his lantern, its flickering flame a small, defiant spark against the oppressive dark. He found them not 50 yards from the cabin, near the skeletal arms of the ancient cottonwood that marked the edge of his small clearing. Buck was digging frantically at a drift, his barks now laced with a distressed whimper, and beneath the snow, a splash of white that wasn't nature's own. Calder's heart, a muscle long accustomed to a slow, steady beat, hammered against his ribs. He knelt, pushing Buck gently aside, and began to dig with his bare hands, the cold biting deep. First, a swatch of lace, stiff with ice, then the curve of a shoulder, shockingly fragile. A woman. Her skin was a ghastly, bluish white, her lips the color of faded violets. She was clad in what looked like a wedding dress, its fine fabric torn and muddied, a cruel mockery in this frozen hell. In one frozen hand, clutched with desperate tenacity, was a small, charred piece of paper. He didn't waste time on questions, on wonder. Survival was a brutal, immediate calculus in these mountains. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed little more than a child, and turned back towards the flickering promise of his cabin, Buck trotting anxiously at his heels, the wind trying to tear her from his grasp. He laid her on the braided rug before the hearth, the closest he had to a soft bed besides his own narrow bunk. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, With a grim efficiency born of long winters alone, he worked. He cut away the sodden, frozen dress, his movements impersonal, focused only on the task. Beneath it, her skin was like ice. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blankets, chafed her hands and feet, forced a trickle of lukewarm, sweetened water between her lips when he could. Buck lay close, nudging her still form with his wet nose, emitting small, anxious whines. For 2 days and nights, she lay there, a still, silent presence in the cabin, a fragile counterpoint to the howling storm outside and the steady rhythm of Calder's solitary life. He kept the fire roaring, spooned broth into her when she seemed able to swallow, and watched. He saw the fine bones of her face, the dark sweep of lashes against pale cheeks, the utter vulnerability. He found himself looking at a faded linen handkerchief he kept tucked in his rucksack, one of Eliza's, embroidered with tiny blue forget-me-nots, and for a moment he almost reached for it to lay on the woman's brow. He caught himself, a familiar ache tightening his chest. This wasn't Eliza. This was a stranger, a mystery brought by the storm. On the 3rd morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world pristine and silent, draped in a blinding white. The sun, a pale disk, cast long, blue shadows. Calder was by the stove, stirring a pot of thin gruel, when he heard it. A sound so faint, he almost missed it. A sigh, then a whisper, weak as a newborn kitten's mew. "Am I alive?" He turned. Her eyes were open, dark and clouded with confusion, like a forest pool stirred by a stone. They fixed on him, wide and uncertain. "Reckon you are," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. He ladled some gruel into a bowl. "Though you gave the pearly gates a good, hard knock." He helped her sit, propping her against some spare blankets. She drank the gruel slowly, her hand trembling as she held the spoon he offered. Color, a faint blush of rose, was beginning to touch her cheeks. "Marbel," she said, her voice a little stronger after the warmth of the food. "My name is Marbel Thorn." Calder nodded, absorbing the name. Thorn, a common enough name, but one that echoed with a sudden, sharp dissonance in the quiet of his mind. He offered no name in return. Not yet. Questions could wait. Survival came first. As the days passed and Marbel slowly regained her strength, pieces of her story began to emerge, not in a flood, but in fragments, like shards of glass from a shattered window. The half-burnt letter, which Calder had carefully dried and smoothed, spoke of a promised future, of a homestead waiting, of a man named Jonathan. Marbel, her eyes often distant, her voice tinged with a bewilderment that tugged at something deep inside Calder, confessed she was a mail-order bride, come west from a life of genteel poverty in a crowded eastern city. She had traveled for weeks, only to be met with this, abandonment in a blizzard. It seemed, though the details remained shrouded in her trauma and the letter's scorched edges. The name Jonathan, however, struck Calder like a physical blow. Jonathan was his younger brother, the restless, charming dreamer who'd left the hardscrabble family farm years ago, chasing whispers of gold and easy fortunes further west. Calder hadn't seen or heard from him in over 5 years. He'd assumed Jonathan was long gone, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving territories, or perhaps had simply forgotten the older brother he'd always found too dour, too rooted. He didn't tell Marbel this, not at first. What was there to say? That the man she'd crossed a continent to marry was his own estranged brother, a man who had now, it appeared, vanished into thin air, leaving her to die in the snow. Marbel knew nothing of where she was, only that the wilderness outside the small cabin windows was vast and terrifying, and that the quiet, weathered man who had pulled her from its icy grasp had not, like everyone else in her recent memory, abandoned her. His silence was a comfort, his gruff care a lifeline. Calder, for his part, found his carefully constructed solitude irrevocably breached. Marbel's presence filled the cabin with a softness, a scent of lavender from a sachet tucked in her meager, salvaged belongings, a quiet rustle of movement that was not Buck's familiar padding. He watched her as she slept by the fire, her face smoother in repose. The harsh lines of fear and exhaustion softened. The firelight would catch the gentle curve of her cheek, illuminate the dark sweep of her hair spread across the faded quilt he'd given her. Sometimes, the light would also fall on the small, folded square of linen Eliza's handkerchief that he'd seen Marbel use to dab her brow when a coughing fit took her. The sight created a strange confluence of past and present, a quiet ache that was both familiar and new. One night, lost in a dream of warmer days and laughter under a summer sky, he'd called out a name in his sleep, a name that hadn't passed his lips in conscious thought for years. Eliza? He woke with a start, the name echoing in the silent cabin. Marbel was still, her breathing even, but he had the unsettling feeling she'd heard. She said nothing the next morning, her gaze as calm and unreadable as ever. But Calder knew she had filed it away. Another piece in the puzzle of the quiet man who had saved her. His routine, once as predictable as the sunrise, was now disrupted. He needed supplies from Redemption, the nearest settlement. A good day's ride if the snow wasn't too deep. But the thought of leaving Marbel alone, vulnerable, or worse, taking her with him and facing the inevitable questions, the knowing glances, the judgment of the town, made him hesitate. He stretched his existing supplies, hunted closer to the cabin, his senses on high alert. He was hiding her, he realized, and the knowledge sat uneasily within him. A few days later, while checking a snare line near the frozen creek, he saw him, Jedediah Carr, his nearest neighbor. If you could call a man who lived 5 miles downriver a neighbor, Carr was a gaunt, watchful man, his eyes missing nothing. He was on horseback, likely checking his own traps. He didn't ride close, just paused on the opposite bank, his gaze fixed on Calder's cabin. Calder saw Carr's eyes narrow slightly, saw him glance up at the thin plume of smoke rising from Calder's chimney. Smoke that, Calder knew, was unseasonably consistent for a man who usually spent his winter days further afield. Checking longer trap lines, Carr nodded once, a curt, unreadable gesture, then rode on. But Calder knew the questions would begin, silently at first, then perhaps not so silently. The isolation of his valley was no longer absolute. The world, with its suspicions and its demands, was beginning to press in. The rhythm of the days in Calder's isolated valley settled into a quiet cadence, marked by the slow retreat of winter and the hesitant unfurling of spring. He spoke little, a man more accustomed to the language of the wind in the pines and the crackle of a solitary fire than to the nuances of human conversation. Yet, his care for Marbel was a tangible thing, a steady undercurrent in the silence of the cabin. He'd leave a bowl of warm broth simmering on the stove when he went to check his trap lines, a silent offering against the chill. He noticed the way she shivered despite the fire's heat and, one evening, without a word, laid out a pair of his own too large but sturdy old boots, lined with rabbit fur, to warm by the hearth. He found a tear in the sleeve of the salvaged dress she wore, the only one she possessed, and the next morning she found it neatly mended, his stitches surprisingly even, if a little rough. Marbel, in turn, began to unfurl the tattered edges of her own story, her voice often low and hesitant, as if the telling itself was a wound reopened. She spoke of the bustling, indifferent city she'd left, the hopeful journey west fueled by ink on paper and the desperate yearning for a new beginning. Then came the chilling confusion of the train station in a raw, unfamiliar settlement miles from anywhere she recognized. The designated meeting point where no one waited. She spoke of the hollow fear as hours bled into a cold, lonely night, the dwindling of her meager funds, the shame of being stranded. Then, the final indignity, a furtive robbery in a crowded, muddy thoroughfare that took her small valise, leaving her with only the clothes on her back and the now charred letter clutched in her hand. Her wandering in the snow had not been a flight from something, but a desperate, aimless stumble towards an end she had nearly met. Each shared fragment was a stone lifted from a heavy burden, offered into the quiet understanding of Calder's presence. Their burgeoning connection was not forged in grand pronouncements or whispered endearments. It was built in the spaces between words, in the simple, unasked-for gestures. Calder, returning from a cold day's hunting, would find the fire already banked high, a precious store of wood neatly stacked beside it. Marbel, her fingers still clumsy from the cold she'd endured, would take one of his worn flannel shirts, its collar frayed, and painstakingly reinforce the seams, her head bent in concentration in the dim lamplight. He once found her shivering by the drafty window, her thin shawl inadequate. The next day, a heavy wool scarf, one he hadn't worn in years, appeared on the peg beside her makeshift bed. These were the unspoken dialogues of their shared existence, a language of mutual care more profound than any spoken poetry. One evening, the wind whistling a lonely tune around the cabin, Calder found himself restless. He pulled down an old, leather-bound ledger from a high shelf, its pages brittle with age and disuse. It had been his father's, a meticulous record of ranch expenses, livestock counts, and the occasional terse family note. He hadn't opened it in years. He idly flipped through the spidery script, memories stirring like dust motes in a sunbeam. Then, his finger, rough and calloused, stilled on a page near the back. Under a section his father had headed Jonathan's Affairs, an entry dated the previous autumn. Arrangements concluded with Miss Marbel James of Boston, Massachusetts. Expected arrival February, 1874. To be wed to Jonathan upon arrival. Passage paid. The word seemed to leap from the page. Stark and undeniable. Marbel James. February. His Jonathan. A cold dread seeped into Calder's bones. He had known, not consciously, perhaps not the exact date or name, but the broad strokes of his feckless brother's plan to secure a wife and, likely, her dowry to fund some new, ill-fated venture, had been hinted at in Jonathan's last, infrequent letter. He had dismissed it then as another of Jonathan's pipe dreams, but here it was, in his father's careful hand. He looked over at Marbel, dozing lightly by the fire, her face softened in sleep, and a wave of guilt, heavy and suffocating, washed over him. His silence, initially born of a desire not to pry, now felt like a betrayal. A few days later, while Calder was out mending a section of fence damaged by a fallen tree, Marbel, seeking a cloth to wipe down the dusty mantle, opened a small, carved wooden box she'd seen tucked away on a high shelf. She'd hesitated to touch Calder's few personal effects, but a strange compulsion drew her. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay the remnants of a life, a love, a delicate lace handkerchief, yellowed with age, bearing the exquisitely embroidered initials Eliza C., a single, pressed prairie rose, its petals like fragile paper, and beneath them, a small, oval daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. Marbel picked it up. It showed a woman with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, quiet warmth. Eliza. The name Calder had called out in his sleep. A pang, sharp and unexpected, went through Marbel. Not jealousy, but a profound sense of understanding, and with it, a chilling premonition that she might only be a guest in a house still haunted by a beloved ghost. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. Marbel quietly placed the open box on the rough-hewn table that separated them. The firelight flickered over Eliza's serene face in the photograph. She was deeply loved, Marbel said, her voice a soft murmur. Yet it carried the weight of her discovery. She looked at Calder, her gaze direct, searching. I cannot live as a shadow in the light of her memory. Calder, I don't ask to replace what you lost, nor could I. But if your heart has no room to build anew, if it is still solely hers, then you mustn't ask me to stay here, trying to fill a space that isn't truly mine to claim. Calder looked from Marbel's earnest face to the contents of the box, his expression unreadable for a long moment. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then he reached out a hand, not to Marbel, but to the photograph. He picked it up, his thumb gently tracing the outline of Eliza's face. "I," he said, his voice low and gravelly. She was my Eliza. He spoke of her then, briefly, haltingly, of their shared dreams for this very piece of land, of the sickness that had taken her too soon, of the long, empty years that followed. It was more than he had spoken of his past to anyone. When he finished, the silence returned, but it was different now, less heavy, with movements that seemed both reverent and resolute. He carefully placed the photograph back in the box. He folded the lace handkerchief, laid the pressed flower beside it. He closed the lid, the click of the latch soft but final. He rose, walked to the old pine chest that held his few spare linens and winter clothes, and placed the small wooden box deep inside. He turned the key in the lock, a decisive sound. He then turned back to Marbel, his eyes, usually guarded, now strangely clear, holding a new, vulnerable light. The past has its place. Marbel, he said quietly. It shapes us, but it doesn't have to be an anchor. The outside world, however, would not be kept at bay indefinitely. One afternoon, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Mrs. Mabel Cook from the settlement downriver, a woman whose knowledge of herbal remedies was matched only by her intricate network of local gossip. She carried a basket, from which protruded a bottle of cough syrup and the edge of some neatly folded calico. Jedediah Carr had evidently shared his observations. Calder, she boomed, her voice filling the small cabin, her keen eyes taking in Marbel in a single, sweeping glance. Heard you might be needin' a few things. Nasty cough goin' round. She bustled in, placing the basket on the table, her gaze lingering on Marbel. A body needs company in these lonely parts, to be sure, but a woman, well, a woman needs her own proper standing. If you take my meaning, tongues in redemption can wag something fierce. Marbel, who had risen quietly, met Mrs. Cook's probing gaze with a calm dignity that surprised even Calder. Your kindness is appreciated, Mrs. Cook, Marbel said, her voice soft but firm. And you are right. A woman needs her standing. I am not here by mischance, nor am I simply asking for shelter. I am choosing to be here. The simple declaration, devoid of defiance, yet imbued with an unshakable resolve, seemed to momentarily silence the older woman. Mrs. Cook looked from Marbel to Calder, a new, thoughtful expression dawning on her face. She nodded slowly. Well, then, that's as may be. She patted Marbel's arm, a gesture that was almost approving, before taking her leave. The unspoken rumors perhaps slightly tempered by Marbel's quiet strength. After Mrs. Cook's departure, the weight of the ledger, of Calder's unspoken knowledge, became too heavy to bear. Perhaps it was Marbel's assertion of choice, or the lingering vulnerability from having finally locked away Eliza's memory box. He retrieved the old ledger, opened it to the fateful page, and without a word, laid it on the table before Marbel. She read the entry, her face pale but composed. She looked up at Calder, his expression etched with a weary anxiety. "So," she said softly, "you knew, or your family did, that I was coming for Jonathan." Calder could only nod, the guilt a bitter taste in his mouth. Marbel traced the faded ink with a fingertip. A long silence fell, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Then she looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not accusation, not anger, but a profound, weary understanding. "You're the one who stayed. Calder," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You stayed. He was the one who left everything, and everyone, behind." Her words were not a pardon, but an acceptance of a truth that bound them in an unexpected way. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the cabin filled with the comforting aroma of rabbit stews, Calder rose from the table. He went to the lean-to and returned with the second, dusty chair that had sat unused for a decade. Without a word, he placed it opposite his own, a silent invitation, a quiet acknowledgement. A space, long empty, was now intentionally, irrevocably filled. The wounds, raw and deep, were beginning to find their own way to scar over, not with bandages, but with the slow, steady balm of shared presence and unspoken truths. The high mountain spring, when it finally decided to wrestle winter into submission, did so with a fierce, breathtaking beauty. The creek, once a ribbon of ice, now roared with meltwater, its banks greening with a speed that felt like a miracle. Marbel, too, seemed to bloom in the renewed warmth, a quiet strength, always present beneath her fragile exterior, now shone through with a steady luminescence. She had started a small herb garden near the cabin door, coaxing life from the rocky soil with a patience Calder found himself admiring. He'd shown her how to read the subtle signs of the land, the way the aspen leaves turned just so before a rains, the particular cry of a hawk that signaled game nearby, laughter, a sound long absent from Calder's cabin, now occasionally graced its rough-hewn walls, soft and hesitant at first, then with a growing, easy confidence. The second chair at his small table no longer felt like an intrusion, but a natural, necessary part of the landscape of his life. A fragile peace had settled between them, unspoken yet deeply felt, like the first warm caress of a Chinook wind after a long freeze. It was into this nascent tranquility that Jonathan returned, appearing on the rise above the valley, as if summoned by some perverse whim of fate. Just as the evening shadows began to lengthen, he rode a tired-looking sorrel, his clothes dusty from travel, but still retaining a certain eastern cut that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of Calder's domain. He was handsome. Calder had to give him that, with the same dark hair as his own, but with a charming, easy smile that Calder had never possessed and had long ago learned to distrust. Buck, who had accepted Marbel with a gentle canine wisdom, bristled at the sight of the newcomer, a low growl rumbling in his chest before Calder silenced him with a look. Jonathan dismounted with a flourish, his eyes, bright and assessing, quickly taking in the scene, the cabin, the wisp of smoke from the chimney, Calder standing stoically by the woodpile, and then Marbel, emerging from the cabin, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "Marbel, my dear Marbel," Jonathan exclaimed, his voice rich and full of a carefully cultivated warmth. He strode towards her, his hat swept from his head. "Praise be, I've found you. The trials you must have endured. I've been half out of my mind with worry." His story tumbled out, a well-rehearsed litany of misfortunes, a delayed train, a misdirected letter, a bout of fever in some God-forsaken settlement, even a brief, unfortunate encounter with less than scrupulous businessmen that had relieved him of a portion of his funds. Through it all, he insisted, his sole aim had been to reach her, his betrothed. He painted himself as a victim of cruel circumstance, his charm working overtime to smooth over the gaping holes in his narrative. Marbel listened, her expression unreadable, the naive girl who had stepped off the train in a strange land, full of romantic notions and timid hopes, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had stared death in the face and had learned the bitter taste of abandonment. When he finally paused, looking at her with an expression of hopeful expectation, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear as a mountain spring. "You left me, Jonathan, at the station. You were not there. But my dearest, the circumstances," he began, his smile faltering slightly. "Circumstances," Marbel interrupted, still calm, "do not excuse leaving a woman alone, without word or means, in a place she does not know. I waited. Then I was set adrift." She did not recount the horror of the blizzard, nor the terror of her near demise. Her quiet dignity was more potent than any accusation. She looked towards Calder, who had remained a silent, watchful presence. "This man, your brother, found me when I was less than a ghost. He asked for nothing. He gave me shelter." Jonathan's gaze hardened as he turned to Calder. "Well, Calder, always the stoic one, playing the savior. Are we?" His tone dripped with old resentments. He then turned back to Marbel, his smile returning, though a little strained. "No matter. I am here now. You are still my betrothed. Marbel, the contract stands. This misunderstanding can be put behind us." It was then Jonathan played what he clearly thought was his trump card. "And this land, Calder," he said, gesturing expansively, "this very valley, it was part of my application for settlement, filed in Helena in conjunction with my marriage proposal to Miss James here. I have the papers, all legal and proper, drawn up by my attorney. This homestead was meant for us. Marbel." He produced a sheaf of documents from his saddlebag with a flourish. "If necessary, I will, of course, assert my claim, perhaps a partnership, brother, or a fair division." The threat hung heavy in the air. Calder finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, devoid of heat but carrying an unshakable resolve. "She's not a piece of property to be claimed or divided. Jonathan, this cabin is mine. This land is mine, bought with sweat and solitude, long before your lawyers ever sharpened their quills. As for Marbel," he looked at her, a flicker of something deep and protective in his eyes. "She doesn't need to be kept. She chooses where she stays." Jonathan scoffed. "Choose? An Eastern lady, alone and destitute. What choice did she have but to cling to the first man who offered her a roof. He turned back to Marbel, his voice softening, wheedling. "Marbel, my dear, think of the life we planned. A proper home. Society. Calder means well, I'm sure. But this is no life for a woman of your refinement." Marbel stepped forward then, positioning herself slightly in front of Calder, facing Jonathan squarely. The firelight from the open cabin door caught the resolute line of her jaw. "The woman you speak of, Jonathan, the one who valued refinement and society above all else. Perhaps she died in the snow. I am what you left behind, a burden you cast off when it became inconvenient. Calder." Her voice softened almost imperceptibly as she glanced back at him. "Calder was the one who saw me, not as an obligation, not as a contract to be fulfilled, but as a human being worth the effort of saving, worth the risk of sheltering. He chose to keep me here, not because of any paper you wave, but because he saw something in me worth staying for. That is a claim no lawyer's document can ever erase." She then added, her voice regaining its quiet firmness. "You left me, Jonathan. You forfeited any right to ask where I go, or with whom I choose to build my life. News of Jonathan's arrival, his charm, his claims, and Marbel's quiet defiance rippled through Redemption faster than a prairie fire. The town, predictably, divided, some swayed by Jonathan's smooth words and the official-looking documents he wasn't shy about displaying on his infrequent visits for supplies, clucked their tongues. That mail-order bride, Mrs. Abernathy, the milliner, was heard to declare, got herself stranded, then latched onto the older brother when the handsome young fiancé finally showed his face. Some women have no shame. Whispers followed Marbel and Calder whenever they were forced to make the trip to town, painting her as an opportunist, Calder as a fool. But there were others. Mrs. Cook, her earlier suspicions allayed by Marbel's steadfastness, sent over a freshly baked apple pie via a neighbor, with a message that some seeds fall on barren ground, and others find good earth, and only a fool can't tell the difference. Henderson, the storekeeper, made a point of greeting Calder with gruff warmth and extending him credit with a pointed lack of scrutiny, a silent acknowledgement of where his own loyalties lay. These small gestures were anchors in the turbulent social waters. Jonathan lingered for a week, a disruptive presence in the valley, sometimes staying at the small, run-down boarding house in Redemption, sometimes camping uncomfortably near Calder's property line, a constant, unwelcome reminder. He tried various tactics, wheedling charm with Marbel, veiled threats of legal ruin to Calder, attempts to garner sympathy in town. But Marbel remained resolute, her calm denials more effective than any shouted argument. Calder met his brother's bluster with a granite silence that seemed to unnerve Jonathan more than any overt aggression would have. The final confrontation was almost anticlimactic. Jonathan, his charm frayed, his legal threats revealed as mostly hollow posturing. He likely couldn't afford to follow through on stood before Calder and Marbel one last time, his handsome face drawn and bitter. "You'll regret this, both of you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier confidence. "This wilderness, it will swallow you whole. Some folks find their peace in wild places, Jonathan," Calder said quietly. "Others just get lost looking for something they were never meant to find." Marbel said nothing, simply stood beside Calder, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a small gesture of unwavering solidarity. Jonathan stared at them. At the united front, they presented, at the quiet strength that emanated from the woman he had so carelessly discarded, and the brother he had always underestimated. He saw no victory here for him, no angle left to play. With a curse muttered under his breath, he swung himself onto his sorrel and rode away, not looking back, a figure diminishing against the vast, indifferent landscape. This time, they both knew he would not return. The ghost that had haunted their fragile peace had finally been laid to rest, not by violence, but by the quiet, unshakable power of choice, and a love that had found its unlikely home in the heart of the storm. The silence he left behind was heavy, yes, but it was also clean, like the air after a cleansing rain, leaving room for new things to grow. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The departure of Jonathan. Though a specter of legal trouble still loomed, left behind a cleaner silence in the valley, an air purified by confronted truths. Calder and Marbel moved within this quietude, their life together unfolding not with grand pronouncements or breathless promises, but with the steady, rhythmic actions of shared existence. There was a profound comfort in the routine. Calder mending a loose cabin board, while Marbel coaxed herbs to sprout in her small, sheltered garden. The shared task of drawing water from the well. The companionable silence of an evening spent with Marbel reading aloud from a worn copy of Shakespeare that had been her father's, while Calder whittled, the shavings falling like soft snow around his boots, Buck sighing contentedly at their feet. One Sunday, the cabin filled with the scent of baking bread, a skill Marbel had mastered with surprising aptitude. She retrieved the old, leather-bound Callaway family Bible from the mantel. Its pages were brittle, filled with the spidery script of Calder's ancestors recording births, deaths, and marriages that stretched back generations. Eliza's name was there, neatly penned by Calder's father after her passing. Eliza Sy Callaway, beloved wife of Calder, entered into rest. Marbel turned to a fresh, empty page in the family record. With a quill Calder had sharpened for her, and a small pot of ink Henderson had gifted them, she wrote, her hand steady, Marbel James Callaway, by choice and by hearth, this day of May, 1874. It was not a declaration for a church or a town, but a quiet anchor dropped deep into the soil of this new life, a personal claiming of her place within the lineage of this man, this home. Calder watched her, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name, a profound sense of rightness settling over him. They began, slowly, to talk of the cabin itself. It was sturdy, built by Calder's own hands and his father's before him, but it was small, bearing the marks of long, solitary winters. It needs more light, Marbel said one afternoon, looking at the single, small window. And so, they planned, not just repairs, but an expansion, a new room that would face the morning sun. Calder found himself sketching plans on a piece of smoothed bark, Marbel offering quiet suggestions. They decided, with a shared, unspoken understanding, what they would call this renewed space, this testament to their joined lives. Mercy House, Marbel had whispered, tracing the words in the dust on the table, not because fate showed us any great mercy, Calder, but because we found it within ourselves, for the past that wounded us, for those who abandoned us, and for the future we are choosing to build, brick by brick, Day by day, word of Jonathan's thwarted claims and Marbel's quiet fortitude had, like seeds on the wind, scattered through redemption. The initial tide of suspicion and condemnation began, slowly, to recede. Folks started to see her not as the pitiful, jilted mail-order bride, nor as the scheming woman who had stolen an older brother's affections, but as something else entirely. A woman of unexpected resilience, of quiet strength, who had faced down abandonment and slander with a dignity that shamed their earlier judgments. A nod here, a hesitant smile there, an extra measure of flour pressed into her hand by Henderson at the mercantile. Small tokens of a community beginning to understand. The specter of Jonathan's legal threat, however, finally materialized in the form of Mr. Alistair Davies, a land inspector from Helens, a man whose starched collar and precise manner seemed utterly alien in the rustic simplicity of their valley. He arrived one crisp autumn morning, his buggy leaving sharp tracks in the frosted earth, official-looking papers in his valise. "Mr. Calder Calloway?" he inquired, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, lingering on the new timber stacked for the expansion. "I'm here regarding a preliminary claim filed by a Mr. Jonathan Calloway concerning this parcel of land, citing intent to settle under a marriage contract." The old tension, momentarily forgotten, returned, coiling in Calder's gut. Marbel stood beside him, her hand instinctively seeking his. Mr. Davies, a man of procedure, suggested the matter be clarified at an informal town meeting to be convened by Justice of the Peace Ellie Singleton, in redemption. Given Mr. Jonathan Calloway's prior statements in the settlement, Davies said, his tone neutral, it would be best to have all pertinent information presented openly. The meeting room above Henderson's store was crowded, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of damp wool and stale tobacco. Calder felt the weight of curious, and in some cases, still hostile, eyes. Marbel, dressed in a simple calico dress Mrs. Cook had altered for her, looked small beside him, yet her composure was absolute. When Justice Singleton, a fair-minded man, invited her to speak regarding Jonathan's claim that she was his intended bride and this land part of their marital arrangement, she stepped forward. Her voice, though soft, filled the hushed room. "I came to these territories," she began, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, "with a promise made to me, a promise that was broken before I ever set foot in this valley. I was left with nothing, abandoned to the elements." She paused, then continued, her voice gaining strength. "Mr. Calder Calloway offered me sanctuary when I had none. He offered me respect when my reputation was questioned. He offered me a place beside him, not as a replacement for a broken contract, but as a woman he deemed worthy in her own right. I am not a bride who failed her vows. I am a woman who was found, who was chosen, and who, in turn, chooses to stand by the man who saw worth in me when no one else did. This home," she glanced at Calder, a deep, unwavering light in her eyes, "is built on that truth, a truth no piece of paper can negate." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces softened with understanding, others with a grudging respect. Then it was Calder's turn. He spoke little of Jonathan's character or Marbel's ordeal. Instead, he unrolled the heavy, oilskin packet he had brought from home. Inside, his father's meticulous records, the original land patent, signed and sealed, clear in his father's name, Isaac Calloway, and then Isaac's last will and testament, properly witnessed, bequeathing the entirety of the Calloway homestead, its land and improvements solely and directly to his eldest son, Calder. The documents predated Jonathan's mail-order bride scheme by nearly a decade. "My brother Jonathan," Calder stated, his voice flat but firm, "has no legal claim to this land. It was never his to promise, nor his to divide." Mr. Davies examined the documents with care, his expression clearing. Justice Singleton nodded. The matter, it seemed, was settled. The cloud that had lingered for so long, finally, definitively, lifted, with the legal claim resolved and their standing in the community solidified by truth and Marbel's quiet courage. A new sense of peace enveloped Mercy House. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, Marbel turned to Calder. "Perhaps," she said softly, "it is time our home had its own blessing, however humble." And so it was that the following spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the valley floor, they were married. Reverend Miles, an elderly traveling preacher making his yearly circuit, agreed to perform the ceremony. It was held not in a church, but in the open air, before the sturdy, welcoming door of Mercy House. The scent of pine and freshly turned earth their incense, the vast blue sky their cathedral. Mrs. Cook was there, her broad face beaming, Henderson standing awkwardly but proudly beside her. Buck lay at Calder's feet, a dignified, furry witness. Marbel, her hand in Calder's, her voice clear and true, spoke her vows. "I weathered a storm to find this harbor. Calder, I vow to be your anchor, your steadfast companion, to stay true and meet all hardships beside you, for as long as we both shall live." Calder, his own voice thick with an emotion that surprised him, looked into her eyes that had seen too much sorrow, yet still held an unquenchable light. "Marbel," he said, his grip tightening on her hand, "you brought warmth back to a cold hearth, and life to a silent house. I vow to tend our fire with care, to keep it burning steady and bright, enough to see us through all seasons, never to blaze out of control, but never, ever, to let it die." Life settled into its new, shared rhythm. The expansion of Mercy House progressed, each nail driven, each board planed, a testament to their joined future. One late autumn morning, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift from a gray sky, Buck, who had been snuffling along the edge of the woods that bordered their clearing, began to bark, a sharp, insistent sound that was different from his usual greeting or alarm. Calder went to investigate, Marbel close behind. There, pressed into the thin layer of fresh snow, almost at the tree line, were footprints, small, impossibly small, as if made by a child no older than 5 or 6. They led from the deeper woods, hesitated at the edge of their clearing, and then retreated back into the shadows of the forest. There were no other signs, no adult tracks, just the solitary, heartbreakingly tiny impressions. Calder stared at them, a knot tightening in his chest. He was no longer a young man. Their life, after so much turmoil, had finally found its quiet harbor. A child. It was a complication, a responsibility he hadn't sought, couldn't have imagined. He looked at Marbel, his face troubled. A lost lamb, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Marbel knelt, her gloved fingers gently tracing the outline of one tiny print before the falling snow erased it. She looked up at Calder, her expression filled with a profound, compassionate understanding that mirrored his own unspoken turmoil. "We both know what it means to be lost. Calder," she said, her voice soft but clear as the winter air, to feel as if there is no one in the entire world to turn to. If there is a child out there, alone in this wilderness. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They stood there for a long moment, the snowflakes beginning to whirl around them, the silence of the vast forest pressing in. Then, Calder met Marbel's gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them. He turned towards the cabin. "I'll fetch my rifle," he said, "not for hunting, but for protection and a warm blanket. And that broth you made this morning?" Mercy House had room enough. Their hearts, tempered by loss and strengthened by a love found in the unlikeliest of seasons, had room enough too. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, as they had every other. The harshness of the Montana winter eventually yielded, not with a sudden, dramatic break, but with a slow, reluctant surrender, much like a stubborn old man finally conceding a point. The air softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of thaw. Inside Mercy House, the rhythm of life had found a new, three-part harmony with the arrival of young Silas, the boy whom Calder and Marbel had found huddled and half-frozen in a hollow log deep in the woods after following those desperate, tiny footprints, was initially as wild and skittish as a cornered fox. His name, they learned weeks later when he finally chose to speak it, was simply Boy, a testament to a life already too acquainted with neglect. Marbel, with a gentle patience that seemed boundless, had suggested Silas for the woods that had both threatened and sheltered him. He was a quiet child, his eyes holding an old sorrow, but slowly, under the steady warmth of their care and Buck's unwavering, furry companionship, he began to unfurl, like a frost-nipped bud daring to trust the sun. Their days settled into a pattern of quiet industry and gentle tutelage. They acquired a small flock of chickens, their cheerful clucking a new sound in the valley. Calder, with Silas often a silent shadow at his side, taught the boy the ways of the woods, how to read animal tracks, which berries were safe, the importance of respecting the wild creatures. Marbel, her hands, once pale and delicate, now capable and browned by the sun, learned the art of beekeeping from an old homesteader's almanac, coaxing honey from the fragrant lilac bushes she'd painstakingly cultivated near the cabin. They welcomed the occasional weary traveler, offering a hot meal and a safe place to rest for the night, their own past hardships making them keenly aware of the vulnerability of strangers in a harsh land. They had learned that mercy, like a well-tended fire, offered warmth not only to the receiver, but also to the giver. In the long evenings, by the flickering lamplight, Marbel would read to Silas, his dark head often nodding against her shoulder, while Calder, on the other side of the hearth, would sketch, not just repairs for the existing cabin anymore, but designs for a larger, more permanent home he envisioned by the creek, nestled near a grove of wild plum trees that burst into a cloud of fragrant white blossoms each spring. It was a shared dream, unspoken mostly, but understood in the quiet smiles that passed between them. The town of Redemption, too, had undergone its own subtle thaw. The sight of Calder and Marbel with Silas, the boy's hand often tucked securely in Marbel's or Calder's, had softened even the hardest hearts. They were no longer just the reclusive widower and the mysterious mail-order bride. They were a family, forged in hardship and bound by a quiet, unshakable affection. Mrs. Cook, a frequent and welcome visitor now, arrived one afternoon with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a bolt of fine, new Irish lace, for whatever a growing boy might need, she said, her eyes twinkling as she looked at Marbel, or for something special, for the woman he will surely call Mother. Every stitch a blessing. Dear girl. The unspoken acknowledgment of Marbel's new role brought a flush to her cheeks and a warmth to her heart that no hearth fire could match. Even the wider community began to see them differently. One spring, a young couple, newly arrived from the east with more hope than experience, made their way up the valley to Mercy House. They'd heard tell of Calder's skill with livestock and Marbel's gentle wisdom with growing things. Shyly, they asked if Calder and Marbel might spare some time to teach them the rudiments of ranching and homesteading. Calder, a man of few words, simply nodded and led the young man towards the lean-to where he kept his tools, while Marbel invited the young woman in for tea and a quiet conversation about the challenges and rewards of making a life in this rugged land. Mercy House was slowly becoming what its name implied, a place of refuge, of shared knowledge, of quiet grace extended. One sun-drenched afternoon, as Silas napped soundly inside, and a gentle breeze rustled the new leaves on the aspens, Calder approached Marbel where she sat on the porch steps, mending one of Silas's small shirts. In his calloused hands, he held something white and delicate. It was her wedding veil, the one she had worn on that terrible journey, the one he had cut from her frozen form. He had kept it, tucked away safely. Now, it was carefully washed. The mud stains faded. The tears painstakingly mended, folded into a neat square. He held it out to her. "I kept this, Marbel," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Figured it was yours to decide what to do with. A piece of your past. Yours to keep, or to let go, however you see fit." It wasn't an invitation to relive a nightmare, nor a suggestion of another wedding. It was an offering, a quiet acknowledgement of all she had endured, and her sovereign right to close that chapter on her own terms. Marbel took the veil, its lace surprisingly soft against her work-roughened fingers. She looked at it for a long moment, a relic of a life unlived, a dream that had turned to ash, only to be reborn in an entirely unexpected form. Then she looked at Calder, at the quiet strength in his weathered face, the deep affection in his steady gaze. She saw a flicker of an old insecurity there, the shadow of Jonathan, the fear of being a second best. She reached out, laying her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "You were never a second choice for me, Calder," she said, her voice clear and true, meeting his eyes. "The man I came west to find was a phantom, a promise on paper. You were the first man who truly saw me, the one who stayed, not from duty or contract, but because your heart chose to. That wasn't an ending to someone else's story. That was our beginning." A slow smile spread across Calder's face, erasing the last vestiges of shadow. He squeezed her hand. The veil, Marbel decided, would not be burned, nor hidden away in sorrow. She would keep it, perhaps in the old Callaway Bible with her name, a testament not to what was lost, but to what had been found against all odds, survival, resilience, and a love as steadfast as the mountains. Not long after, Calder took down the small, locked box that had held Eliza's mementos. He had spoken with Marbel about it, a quiet conversation filled with shared understanding. With her standing beside him, he carefully removed the embroidered handkerchief. He had crafted a simple frame from a piece of polished cedar. He placed the delicate linen inside, then hung it on the wall of their main room, a place of quiet honor. Beneath it, he affixed a small, hand-carved wooden plaque. The inscription was simple, deeply felt. Eliza Calloway, she who walked ahead, for those who remain, and those to come. It was not a shrine to a past sorrow, but a gentle acknowledgement of a love that had shaped him, now taking its place within the larger story of a heart that had found the capacity to love again, deeply and anew. Marbel laid her head on his shoulder, her silence a comforting affirmation. The new house by the creek, the one Calder had dreamed of and sketched, took shape slowly, built with their own hands, with Silas often helping by fetching small tools or offering unsolicited, cheerful commentary. It was larger than the old cabin, with wider windows to let in the sun, and a porch that overlooked the rushing water and the wild plum grove. When it was finally complete, solid and welcoming, Calder brought out a piece of weathered pine he had been carefully carving for weeks. Together, he, Marbel, and young Silas, who now proudly called them Pa and Mama, hung it over the sturdy new door. The letters were plain, deeply etched, unadorned. The Mercy House. There was nothing grand about it, nothing to boast of to the wider world. But as they stood back to look at it, Calder's arm around Marbel's shoulders, Silas tucked securely between them, Buck thumping his tail contentedly at their feet. They knew it was more than enough. It was solid, enduring, a sanctuary built not merely of wood and stone, but of courage, forgiveness, and a love that had weathered the fiercest storms. The spring that had come to their valley, and to their hearts, needed no grand pronouncements. Its beauty was in its quiet strength, its resilience, its simple, profound grace. Mexent, the wind had settled, the fire burned low, and the world outside the cabin whispered no demands. Marbel sat by the window, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, eyes fixed on the horizon. Calder stood behind her, not touching, not rushing, just there, present. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your brother had come instead?" she asked softly. Calder didn't answer right away. He looked out, beyond the trees, toward the ridgeline that had once divided them all. "He didn't," he finally said. "And you did." Her hand reached back, blindly, and found his. The silence after wasn't empty. It was a promise neither of them needed to say aloud. Was it fate that brought her to Calder? Or just a broken promise that led to something better? Should he have told her the truth from the start? Would you have stayed? Or walked away? And if stories like this stir something quiet in your chest, go ahead and subscribe for more Wild West tales of love, loss, and second chances. There's always another story riding in with the next wind.